on the first panel this morning, when we get going, I'm being joined by my friend and colleague, Katherine Fletcher, who is the Conservative MP for South Ribble, and she is also the Parliamentary Private Secretary to COP26 President Alok Sharma. She has a really strong background in science and a very deep interest in the environment, and she is also passionate about nature, improving habitats to benefit wildlife and us all. So very much looking forward to hearing from Katherine this morning. We also, as I think you can probably all see on your screen now, been joined by Gareth Redmond-King, who is a COP26 expert at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. Gareth was previously head of climate change at the World Wildlife Fund UK, where he led a team of climate specialists working on UK policy, advocacy and campaigning to tackle climate change and restore nature. Gareth also has 15 years experience working across government, including directly for ministers, and is extremely knowledgeable on COP26 as well as other international environmental efforts. And finally, on the first panel, which is the road to COP26 and where to next, I'm delighted that our very own Andy Bell from North Devon, who is the UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve Coordinator and responsible for developing the North Devon UNESCO International Biosphere Reserve. And when it comes to promoting and understanding environmental causes in North Devon, Andy really is a leading expert. And I'm very lucky to live in a village where his innovation have helped us actually restore some sand dunes and enable them to grow along the beach to keep our sand actually in the whole sand system of the Tor and Torridge double estuary. So I am delighted that we are going to be moving into this next panel. Hello, I can see Andy and Gareth, and I know that we're just waiting for Katherine to join us. Good morning, lovely to see you. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to leave you all in charge of muting and unmuting yourself. And Katherine, I've done the introductions, which hopefully you've heard some of, but as we've lost Lord Deben, we're going to start this panel a little bit early. Thank you all so much for joining us. And Katherine, I'm going to hand over to you first. So each speaker is going to give us 5 minutes introduction, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A section. So thank you so much. And Katherine, over to you.
Morning, Selene. Morning, Devon. I'm very, very pleased to speak to you today. You'll notice that I'm bereft of black eyes. Unfortunately, when I was in Devon at the start of August, my mountain biking capability on Dartmoor met with reality. So I love you guys very much, but I'd like to not come back with a black eye again next time due to my own incompetence. Anyway, apart from being a terrible mountain biker, I'm also the Parliamentary Private Secretary to Alok Sharma, who, as I'm sure you guys all know, is the CPD, COP President Designate, for the conference that's coming up and this event is here to celebrate. What I thought I'd do with my opening remarks is, rather than diving off down into the detail, is actually just set the scene a little bit, because even like those of us that are kind of interested and engaged in this sphere don't necessarily know what the COP is or what it's about. So if you bear with me for 2 minutes, it is 197 parties plus the EU coming together under the auspices of the UN. So Alok is, whilst he is a member of government and a cabinet minister, he's studiously neutral. He's a UN appointee whose job it is to convene the parties. So COP stands for Conference of the Parties. And he's pulling together from all over the world for a series of key aims. Now, COP26 is chaired and has set out what it wants to achieve, and in simple terms, it's to pull everybody together to get global net zero by 2050 and to keep the idea of global warming to 1.5 degrees C or less. So you'll have heard keep 1.5 alive, and it sounds easy, but if you put that into context, Alok's job is to engage, encourage, persuade, push ambition to Russia and China agree with America, so Iranians agree with Israelis, so that the Mexicans agree with the Venezuelans, and you can kind of go through it. It becomes a lightning rod for all of the beautiful tapestry and colour and disagreements and friendships, and you know, the man has had a busy schedule, shall we put it like that. But what else is he doing, asking, encouraging people to do? Well, as well as asking them to submit as a country ambitious NDCs, nationally determined contributions, where people are saying, yes, we will try and achieve this to help keep 1.5 alive. He's also mobilising finance So in previous COPs, there has been an agreement that we would together across the planet mobilise £100 billion of finance to support adaptation and mitigation, support those who perhaps may be exposed to some of the worst effects of climate change, but don't necessarily have the money to help them transition through to the greener fuels or to adapt and mitigate existing climate change, which we're all seeing at the moment. And that getting that figure delivered is absolutely crucial, I think, to take the whole planet with us. I know it's a big focus of Alok and CPD's time to try and make sure that we can get that finance mobilised from governments, and also working with Mark Carney to start to really engage the private sector to put money where we need it to make some of these things happen. And then what does it come down to? Cars, coal, we need to stop using coal, we need to start transitioning how we use our transport networks, and then you start to get into the measures of net zero, which is really interesting, and I'm sure we'll start to touch on during this debate. So thanks for having me, Elaine. I hope that's helpful, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion and some decent questions, although I may just pop and put the light on.
Thank you ever so much, Katherine, for that, and I'm going to hand over to Gareth. Gareth.
Hello, good morning. I'm now very worried about Lord Deben. I personally consider him to be a national treasure, so I do hope he's okay and turns up. The road to COP, this session is billed as. The road to COP is very much about the meeting, what the meeting itself needs to achieve. So it's about what the work that needs to be done in advance to ensure it succeeds, and Catherine's just talked about some of that. COP26 UN Climate Summit. It's 5 years from the historic Paris Agreement that Katherine also referenced, at 5+1 if we count the COVID delay. But this makes it a really important milestone after Paris. Paris committed to keeping warming to well below 2 degrees, striving for the relatively much safer level of 1.5 degrees. And as we know, since the Industrial Revolution, we've already seen temperatures rise by just over 1 degree. And we can see the harm that is done at 1 degree. We've seen it this summer with massive fires and extremes of heat and floods and hurricanes. 2 degrees is extremely dangerous. And unfortunately, we discovered yesterday that even with enhanced promises made by 113, only 113 of those 197 parties to the COP, we're on track for even more than that, perhaps as much as 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. That feels a long way off the end of the century, but kids born today and over the last decade in this country will very likely see that. They will see the devastation that brings. So COP26, 5 years on from Paris, it's a really important moment for countries to step up their ambition and bring that 2.7 number down very much closer to 1.5. COP26 needs to deliver a package that keeps 1.5 alive. So before COP26, that means that governments need to do 3 things. One is put together real plans for further deep, rapid cuts in emissions. That's things like, as Katherine mentioned, ending reliance on coal, and we cannot say that enough. Ending reliance on coal is so important, and the UK is leading the way with that. Cleaning up electricity, using wind and solar to generate more clean power so that we can electrify things like how we heat our homes and how we power our cars, but also tackling emissions from agriculture and from waste and protecting nature. Nature is crucial to this. Natural systems absorb some of our emissions, so they can help us do this job, things like trees and soil and peatlands. The second thing Katherine's also mentioned as well is real money to help poorer nations. Rich countries promised that by 2020, they'd be giving 100 billion a year in climate finance to help poorer nations. That's not just important in terms of what those poorer nations need to do, but it's also about delivering on a promise. And showing that you can deliver on promises is really, really important to any negotiation. And third, it's about real world action, ending reliance on fossil fuels, particularly coal. We're going to keep mentioning coal, to stop deforestation, another one of those natural systems. We're destroying global systems like the Amazon rainforest at a terrifying rate. And that not only stores carbon, but it regulates our climate in other really important ways as well. And real action to cut methane. We're going to hear more about methane over the next few months. It's the most potent of greenhouse gases. Whilst it doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide, its effect is 30 times greater than carbon dioxide, and it's responsible for about 1/4 of all of that warming. And human activities count for just over half of it that is in the atmosphere. It leaks from our energy production, coal again, and it's produced by agriculture and waste. So that's all before COP. That's what we need to do before COP, real plans, real money, real commitments, so that at COP, governments can then agree a deal to move faster on those Paris Agreement promises. That means looking ahead to 2023, when, again, built into the agreement, there's a global stocktake, which is the point when ideally those 2030 emissions pledges should be revised up again, and countries should be providing detailed long-term plans for how they're going to deliver it. Also, a clear sense of how richer countries, having delivered on that 100 billion by then, we hope, can close the finance gap into the future as well. They need to negotiate to up that level in coming years to make more of it available for countries to adapt to climate impacts, and also to help those poorer countries pay for the loss and damage that they experience as a result of climate impacts. This isn't charity, by the way. This isn't just a good thing for us to do. Wealthy countries have been burning fossil fuels for a very, very long time. It's helped to grow our wealth. So we do owe it to people in parts of the world vulnerable to the impacts, things like rising sea levels, devastation from hurricanes. We owe it to help to protect their lives, their livelihoods, their communities from the effects of all that fossil fuel burning, even as we try and reduce the fossil fuel burning as well. They contribute very little to the problem, but the costs of the impacts fall very heavily on them. And finally, at COP, we need to see countries agreeing a move away from investment in fossil fuels. Katherine referenced that work that Alok Sharma is doing with Mark Carney, who used to be governor of the Bank of England. That is a lot about moving the investment away from things like coal and towards things like clean power and climate solutions instead. That's it sounds like a big old list, and that's because it is. But in short, countries need to live up to the promises that they made in Paris just over 5 years ago. All of the polling here and around the world shows that that is what people want, that's what people expect. And straightforwardly, it means cutting our emissions, it means protecting and restoring nature so that nature can protect us, and it means wealthy nations helping people in poorer nations who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Gareth. And finally, over to Andy Bell. Andy, good morning.
Good morning. How do you follow that? Gareth has just sort of given a really sort of good sort of run through there of what everything I was hoping to say as well. So I could just say, well, just what he said. So that'd be fantastic. But I mean, the role for I'll speak of it from 2 points of view, from an international perspective, because I work with UNESCO on developing nations as well. And certainly what Gareth said, that one of the key things is that lower and middle income countries that need that support to actually sort of make that transition as we move them out of poverty into more usable sort of lifestyles, if you like, is that we need to sort of make that transition much easier and on a low carbon trajectory. So sort of investing into that is going to be one of the important things. And as we work on those solutions for those low and middle income countries, particularly the ones with sites that I work in, it's quite important. We use those as demonstration sites. So the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve Network, it's now 727 sites around the world, can use those as demonstrations of how to actually make those leaps into a better future, if you like, by linking people and nature. So we see those things being really important. We also want to see that, COP26 securing those good delivery plans in each country and making sure we've got the NDCs right for each country to get us onto that 1.5 trajectory, but to make sure that the delivery plans are really going to work well and that they're integrated and that they're working across the board. They're not just kind of siloed into something just as a nice to do. They have to be sort of monitored, which is again is a good role for the UN agencies to try and sort of hold their feet to the fire, literally, and do that monitoring. So obviously the key things as well that again Gareth reflect on is we've got the mitigation, and looking at a local perspective across North Devon, there isn't a single silver bullet that's going to get us out of this. So we need a good energy policy. We need to accept that we're going to have more renewable energy. What are the impacts of that? But also sort of live with that and say, well, the counterfactual isn't great. If, as Gareth says, if people sort of burning coal all the time elsewhere, then it's not going to sort of be great for us anyway. So we might as well look at sort of what we can do best with the renewable energy options we have, and energy efficiency. Making sure that we can actually really reduce some of our emissions in our domestic and industrial uses. So 30%, North Devon being a rural area, 30% of our transport emissions, are from cars and the like. So again, sort of reducing that transition to different transport systems is going to be vital. And this is, as I say, moving sort of beyond the COP is actually that delivery sort of work that we need to do. So it's the action is down to sort of people and governments and the private sector again. So releasing that energy of the private sector, but again with those caveats that it needs to be, you've got to be careful what you wish for and how you do this, and give clear policy guidance and strict guidance on how that's used and how that happens. So as we move into the renewable energy sector, yes, we've got lots of resources here we can use and exploit, but we need to do it in the right way to make sure we're not killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And as Gareth said, it's the nature-based solutions which actually help and protect us that we need to sort of protect at the same time. So we've got sort of various solutions, but also we need to look at the adaptation we need to do in the area, because we're going to have a lot of impacts coming our way over the next 100 years that we need to adapt to. And living here on the estuary, as Selene said, we've got 1 metre of sea level rise that we need to deal with over the next 100 years. And that means that we're looking at how we keep those nature-based solutions working in the estuary, which do protect us. So we do have sea level protection from salt marshes, from dunes, etc. So how we are adapting our coastlines to manage that. And that needs a fair bit of rejigging, if you like, around the estuary, because as we sort of recreate those new salt marshes, what we're losing is some of those floodplain and grazing marshes, which means we need to replace those as well. There's a domino effect that we need to sort of articulate through. So all of these plans are interconnected, and we need to reflect that and embrace that complexity, but make sure we sort of do things in the right way, keep that working. So like I say, trying to capitalize on those synergies and interactions. So we've got natural capital and biodiversity plans. The North Devon is good, has a good record for biodiversity, but it's not brilliant. Whilst we do have some areas that are recovering, we are just like a lot of the rest of the country it's declining, but not declining so fast because of all the work we've done. But we need to get it back on the up. So there's a lot of effort in there, and we use those nature-based solutions that we can then use as adaptation and mitigation measures as well. And we need to look at that sort of balance between food security and energy security in natural systems, and looking at a land use plan across the area, how those things fit together. And sustainable intensification platform could be one of the ways that we could do that, working with our universities and research institutes to try and secure that. But there's far more kind of social fabric as well that needs to be sort of changed as well. So coming back to the sort of three things is, let's get a good deal at COP26. Let's secure some sort of really good plans, making sure we can meet our international obligations and support those developing countries. Get the private sector engaged, involved. And then when it comes to sort of working locally, is look at those integrated plans and how we get the best for North Devon to make sure it stays a good place to be.
Fantastic, and thank you all for that. Now there's a huge number of questions coming in, so I think panelists, if you want to use the age-old wave your actual hand at me if you'd like to actually have the answer to the question, it's probably going to work best. And Katherine, I think the first couple, the two of us are going to have to fend off, because there's quite a lot coming through asking about government policy. So I'm interested in Andy and Gareth's views, but the first one is from George Curry, who is on the call. So we had a few pre-submitted for this panel, and he asks, the UK CCC 2021 progress report says the government has made historic climate promises in the past year. However, it has been too slow to follow these with delivery. Does the panel agree that the government's action on climate change falls short of its rhetoric? And I'll let Katherine go first, and then see if Andy Gareth have got anything to add.
I would say there's a prejudice in that question, or certainly a set of assumptions. Wow, I think the Brits. So I'm supporting Alok in going around the world, trying to galvanise the world. Britain could be halo polishingly perfect, and it will not keep 1.5 alive. So you'll forgive me that I will stay focused on that mission that the British government has stepped forward to do, which is to provide some global leadership there. But when CPD goes around the world, he has national states saying, God, you Brits have done really well. How have you done it? How have you taken the public with you? You know, what tips have you got? You think about the amount of coal that we've taken out of our energy generation system since 2010. There's some phenomenal figure. It's down to 4% or so. And we rightly worry and challenge when the wind drops and we have to put that back on again. But we shouldn't narrowly focus on the minor steps that we have to take that's not in the direction we want to head, because the rest of the world, by and large, is looking at us saying, Wow, yeah, the Brits really are showing global leadership and are managing difficult conversations in their countries in the way that we do, where we have lots of people that want to go really far really quickly, and there are lots of people that are really worried about the pace of change and the cost of change and whether the change is going in the right direction and it's proven. And the job that Selene and I and other members of government have is kind of finding that balance. What I would say very clearly is we should be absolutely confident that the commitment's there to get it right. We know the NDC, the nationally determined contribution that we've just submitted ahead of COP, is really world leading. It's very challenging to achieve, but the fact that we've got that legally binding target in law, which is another world first, and the fact that I know there's lots and lots and lots of conversations going on saying, how do we make this happen? I think you should have confidence that people are engaged. But I'm not going to say that we have every single answer, because we don't.
Thanks, Katherine. Gareth, Andy, do you have anything you'd like to add?
If I may, by any measure, the UK is a climate leader. The UK has achieved amazing progress in terms of cutting emissions over the last decade or so. They're down over 40% on 1990 levels, which is our sort of baseline year for these targets, at a time when growth has increased dramatically. And certainly our power system is world leading. Somebody asked in the questions about the government recently approving a new coal mine. What I was referring to in terms of the government leading the way on coal is the commitment to get coal out of power generation, and that's going to happen in the next year or two. It's still subject to an inquiry, mercifully, so we can keep our fingers crossed that there may not be a new coal mine. That's for steel production, but steel production needs to stop using coal as well. And the CCC, Lord Demon may have mentioned that if he can make it, but steel needs to stop using coal as well. So we don't need the new coal mine. But the UK is a leader, and it is important, even as a relatively small proportion of annual global emissions. It is important that the UK continues to be a leader, with the 5th biggest emitter historically. We started the Industrial Revolution. We've been doing it for longest, and we can have an influence on other countries. We have had an influence on other countries, and we have an influence on the market. We are the biggest single market for offshore wind in the world at the moment, and the UK's investment in that has brought the costs down and improved the technology, and that's for everybody. So for every country, offshore wind is now cheaper as a result, in large part, of the UK's investment in it. So we are important in that leadership. We do have gaps in terms of how we deliver on those really ambitious targets, and they do still need to be filled. And the most important thing that no doubt Katherine and Selene will be reminding their colleagues in the Treasury is that it's more expensive for us not to do this. It's more expensive for us not to take this action now. And if we invest in these solutions as soon as we possibly can, then there are billions and billions of pounds worth of benefits to the UK in terms of the economics of that, the jobs and the growth.
Thank you. Sorry, my question box open. I've lost Andy. Andy, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I could add something in it. We've seen sort of various attempts in the past, and I'm not the expert on this particular field, but we did try to work on it with local actors on Energy 361, for example, with home insulation and improving that, because the housing stock in North Devon is typically old and sort of drafty as anything else. So it was just successive attempts by any government, I think, to try and address the home energy solutions to reduce that has been. It's always been sort of stumbling, and it'd be nice to see if we can actually sort of try and achieve that. I mean, it's not through lack of effort, but it's just we always seem to create a system that just doesn't sort of really sort of help it work. So we'd like to see a much more streamlined way to help domestic energy work. That would actually sort of go a long way to helping the government sort of meet its targets. They are what the government set out in policy is good, and it just about gets us to that 1.5, and and that really is a flag for the government to wave, but. It's the delivery, the now, that really counts. We need to do that fairly soon, because it's not what we get down to zero emissions by 2050. It means what's the area under the curve. We need to sort of start making those cuts now, so to getting that delivery done now. So I mean, I do congratulate the government on its policies and etc. like that, but we do need to get that delivery right. And that was just one example. Peatlands, we could do more on peat and that sort of thing. There's other ideas where we could take those further. But again, it just needs that deeper thought and that action really sort of from the community as well to be more receptive.
Thank you. And as it was touched on during those answers by Gareth, I've got a couple of questions come in. So one from Steve in the Q&A, who's asked, how is a licence for Cambo consistent, even with the UK's existing carbon zero target? And one in the chat from Stuart, who's asking a question specifically to Katherine. The proposed Cambo oil field off Shetland, there's an argument that we will keep burning oil, so it's better to get it from nearer to home, or an opposing view that we need to show leadership by not opening up new extraction. And what's your view? So coming to you first, Katherine.
I'm not close to the detail because there's a bit of a misconception that the COP department does everything green in government. When I talk about the lots of conversations going on, it's true. So COP is very focused on international negotiating success, and the delivery departments, so the Department of Transport, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, MHCLG for home insulation. So I'm not dead close to Cambo, so you'll have to forgive me, I can't give you a specific on that. But I'll make a generic point, which is there is no straight line to achieving net zero unless we are willing to accept very, very major changes to lifestyle. And I'm not, and I'm talking enormous changes. So we are going to have to think very hard about things and zig and zag. We can't only be pure, it's net in the net zero. And the gas situation more broadly, when you talk internationally, what we need to do is get rid of coal. And whilst gas is not helpful in terms of it is a fossil fuel and it still is emitting carbon, it is nowhere near as bad as coal. And there is a role for it, especially in the developing world, as a transition fuel to remove, as a least worst option. Now, where that particular thing, I'm sorry, I won't say, because if I say it'll just be my personal opinion and I've got it wrong somewhere because I haven't looked it up. But the broader point, we will not do everything in a straight line, or if we do, then that there's a lot of consequences to that. And my personal opinion is we won't take the public with us. And I think we have to maintain and engage as many people as possible on this journey, because there are going to be some tough choices on it.
Can I disagree ever so slightly, but in a good way, Katherine? I don't think it does involve massive lifestyle changes for us to be able to reduce emissions in the way that we need to. And there was a study that came out just a couple of weeks ago that showed, how in terms of our personal lifestyles, relatively incremental changes to most of what we do can make the
I completely agree with that. I'm talking really big picture, how we make sure there's electricity when you put the plug in and that, that kind of malarkey.
But in relation to Cambo specifically, another study recently showed us that we need to keep 60% of oil and gas in the ground. We mentioned coal because, as Katherine says, it's the dirtiest, it's the most urgent, it is doing the most harm, and it has so many other appalling effects as well. You need only look at the smogs in China that relies so heavily, and India that relies so heavily at the moment on coal. But I think there's a job that the companies that are developing the solutions to this, and increasingly politicians and government and just everybody who's in this really need to do to help us all to understand what these changes are. And only half of people in the UK flew in a normal year. Let's not talk about last year, but in a normal year. So, when we talk about flying less, we're not talking about everybody having to stop ever going on holiday ever again. We're talking about people who fly several times a week. We don't all have to become vegan, but we do need to start thinking about eating less meat and less dairy. So there are changes to lifestyles that are important. governments need to be part of keeping the oil and gas in the ground and of phasing out the coal, and they need to work with companies to help us to make the transition to these things. You know, no new technology came along and everybody went, hey, that's great, we love it, let's all use it from tomorrow. And in many people's lifetimes, we've had changes in the way that our homes are heated, and we've had different things plugged in and different technology plugged in. Heat pumps are just the next one of those.
Fabulous, and thank you. I'm going to move on from there to, there's been a number of questions asked, and Brian Garman submitted one in advance around promoting plant-based diets, and I think there's a dispute as to who should even be promoting it. And as someone who's proud to represent an area with 473 farmers in it, and actually who produce food very, very effectively, and that actually, I can't remember the exact stat, but if every cow was as productive as the cows of North Devon, we'd have about 10% of the total cows left in the world to still provide the same amount of meat. So I just wondered what your views were on plant-based diets and how that would be compatible to our North Devon farmers. Perhaps come to you, Andy, first. Thoughts on veganism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good one. It's one thing that North Devon and sort of the southwest is good at is growing grass. It's not a great arable place, so to actually sort of convert completely to a kind of veganism is not going to work on that small kind of area. So we'd actually be saying, well, so what would the land use be if the whole country turned vegan? What would the land use and the be for the North Devon area? If we can't grow grass, then what would we grow instead? So would that be sort of a swap then for some of those the big nature-based solutions and the ecosystem services and maximising on carbon sequestration? Would that be the alternative? And then having to sort of rely on our own food security or food sources to be elsewhere. So it's one of those big conundrums that doesn't really sort of work too well if you look at it on a kind of bioregional basis. You know, we try to think of North Devon and the Biosphere Reserve as a kind of bioregional planning exercise in many ways. So how would you work almost as if North Devon was an island, and veganism wouldn't work on that kind of scale. So you'd have to sort of think much more on a kind of national scale in swapping between the two. So it's it is quite a conundrum, and that you know, we do sort of take pride to say that the beef that's produced here tends to be sort of much more efficient than possibly in other countries. So we have that benefit there. So cutting down on meat is certainly sort of something that we should be considering. You know, because that just does make sense, because, you know, you look at the amount of energy it takes to create that beef in the first place, then, you know, there's all the land efficiency would help, which means that we could then have more space then for the carbon sequestration and those nature-based solutions. So this relates back to that thing I mentioned about sustainable intensification platform we were working with Rothamsted Research on how do you do that share and spare debate on land to get the best of ecosystem services and all that biodiversity that protects us, but also have those food production systems and carbon sequestration going on. So we need that kind of approach to it. And certainly reduction of meat would be part of that solution.
Thanks, Andy. Gareth, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, again, often to go back to my flying example, often when we talk about flying, you know, people who say, well, you can't stop people flying, you know, so they start from the assumption that we're all flying all of the time. And it's very similar with food. Actually, there have been huge shifts in people's diets in this country over the last few years. And when supermarkets survey people's eating habits, they find that far more people are flexitarian, i.e., you know, they're a bit vegetarian some of the time, they're even a bit vegan some of the time. Far more people have diets that exclude meat or exclude meat for a large chunk of the time. We are sort of making those shifts as we understand the impacts and the health benefits and the quality issues and the issues of how farmers best make a living and how we support decent food amongst decent, you know, the good farming from a sort of climate point of view. As people understand more of this, they're adjusting, but they're not suddenly just, you know, switching off the supply and going vegan, because that would create new problems if we were all to do that. I'm not saying people shouldn't choose to go vegan if they want to, but also I asked my colleague, I'm not an expert on land use, and I asked my colleague the other day, who is an expert on land use, if you were to look around the world and go, you know, where is a great example of a country that is getting to grips with this and making their agriculture better? And he said, well, to be honest, you'd be hard pushed to find somewhere that wasn't further ahead than the UK in terms of thinking about how you pay farmers to do the right thing for the land and to make sure that you're making the best use of the land and producing the best quality, lowest impact food. And then, you know, we're all going to carry on making that shift. And that's, you know, that's the really important thing, is understanding that if we just eat less meat and dairy, we don't have to close down a whole industry, but we can dramatically reduce our impact.
Thank you, Gareth. I think it's a really interesting point. And when you actually look at where some of the plant-based solutions that are promoted actually have come from, they're a lot further than a nice farm just down the road from us here in lovely North Devon. So Katherine, I'm going to come to you next on this one, because this is a question that I get asked up here an awful lot. So they want to know.
You're definitely down for me, Solange. You're definitely down there for me. You're not, there's no up in between Lancashire and Devon.
It feels up.
Go on.
North Devon, that A361, it's a long way. The Rosie Hallworth-Booth has asked, why do many Conservative MPs prefer the government's Environment Bill, which does not demand legally binding targets, to the Climate and Ecological Emergencies Bill, which does? And so I have quite strong views on this, Katherine, but I'll let you go first.
Okay, so part of this massive change is Gareth is correct in that there are lots of little changes, but when you put all those little changes together over the period of a century, it's going to be an enormous change. It's going to be, you know, similar to what happened when all of my relatives stopped, you know, kind of running around for some lord in a field and went into the cities of Manchester and Stoke and, you know, started working in factories. It's going to be that scale of change in terms of how we wire up. There's politics in it, and so I think the government's got a really good record on the climate and environment, and it's part of the reason that when I read all the manifestos and picked the one I disagreed with the least, I ended up with the blue rosette a few years ago. And the opposition want to say that it's all awful and we're all doing really bad, so they've produced their own. When I look at the two of them, taking aside the politics, I really don't see I don't see much fundamental difference. You know, I think the actions are the same. I think the targets are the same. You know, working to keep 1.5 alive, showing global leadership to get people to come in. So I would say the answer to that is probably politics, which is a human condition. But actually, I'm confident that the UK is genuinely cross-party, really quite far ahead of the rest of the world in terms of discussing, addressing and moving forward with these issues.
Thank you, Katherine. And so moving on, I've got a really interesting question from Tracy and Richard Elliott in the chat, and so you say, as has been discussed, the UK is doing well on decarbonising the low-hanging fruit. What do the panel think are the most challenging areas of the economy to decarbonise? Gareth. Oh no, Katherine's there, she's straight in.
No, well, no. So I think this is personal views. I'm not speaking of the government. Andy's already touched on it. For me, it's the housing stock and how to insulate our lovely, gorgeous Victorian sash windows and sanded floors, or solid. You know, I've got a 1970s extension on my bungalow, and it's solid wall, it's solid floor. You know, the work. Oh, I've got a visitor. The work that I've got to do to make that be really efficient in whatever heat is put in it, whether it's air source, ground source. You know, for me, that's a real biggie, that one, because it is genuinely destructive. If you're going to have to move out of your bedroom and put stud in and lose an inch all the way off your bedroom to allow it to be a more efficient box, that's a big upheaval. Now, that's not necessarily going to give us the most bang for our carbon buck, but I think as soon as it starts meaning you've got to redecorate your bedroom, it becomes tangible very quickly. And because the other alternative home heating sources, are literally not on fire most of the time, you're going to need really, really well insulated homes. So that's the big one for me. And I think North Devon's internet's kicked Solange off, unless has it. Go on, Gareth. What do you reckon?
I was going to say maybe it was her doorbell. Maybe it wasn't hers. No. I would have started with housing as well. I mean, globally, coal, and globally, systemic things like aviation, where there isn't really a solution for long distance aviation in the short or medium term. Sustainable aviation fuels are, a minuscule portion of the thing, and they compete with other things that we need land for. But here in the UK, the biggest single source of emissions at the moment is transport. And the transition to how we move around. And I say this really carefully as somebody living in London and talking to people in North Devon, because different parts of the country have different needs in terms of transport and access to what is realistic and sustainable in terms of your day-to-day lives, never mind what is sustainable in terms of climate. But that is the thing that we need to crack as well. And some of that is behavior change. A lot of that is industrial change. A lot of that is infrastructure, so that people in North Devon or in Lancashire, not in cities with good infrastructure for getting on and off different sorts of transport, are able to have affordable electric vehicles as an alternative to petrol and diesel, so that we can focus on the really difficult end of transport, which is the bigger things, the HGVs and the planes, and the things that we use to ship our goods around the world.
Yeah, I'd agree. Andy, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, well, you said it again. The housing, retrofit is the big challenge, and that was where we were getting stuck in the past. Was we're trying to fit the metrics around it and banks for bucks and this sort of thing, and it was just getting way too complicated. Where we could have just sort of gone on and done it. But and I think that one, and the other thing that sort of think about nationally, we talk about unavoidable emissions. And Gareth says, there are sort of things with aviation that we need to look at. But it's just on this pathway of getting to net zero is that we get a big rush at the moment. We've got aviation companies trying to buy land in North Devon to grow trees. And we need to think about, well, actually, are they really making that commitment to moving towards net zero first before we actually sort of start releasing the valuable assets of where we sort of plant trees, for example, and that land is only there once. Once you plant the trees on it, you start your sequestration there, you can't use it again. So it's just making sure we're getting the right people coming in first and saving our offsetting methods for those that absolutely need it. So we'd actually get the equations right, because there's not enough resource to go around. We need to be very careful on how we sort of share that land out for the different uses.
I'd agree. Do you mind if I come back? Just something's just triggered for me. I'm going to kind of keep focusing on the people and the people journey. So the other thing is the commons. When I came up from the Team Valley and went up onto the top on Dartmoor on the commons, the use or the intensive use of land for very traditional practices. We've got lots of hills and lots of sheep up here, and I'm going to be really honest. I was pretty, I was a bit at the Dartmoor, because I've never been up before. Wow, that's heavily grazed. There's the, and I'm not saying that our hill, if I'm looking at the Pennines out the window, I'm not saying ours aren't. So again, to what extent do we find a balance between using the land we're using for agriculture in an intensive way, and leaving more space for nature, and those conversations? And I watched a documentary the other day about the Scottish Highlanders, tradition of peat cutting for heating the homes in the winter, and how it's a big community event, and it all looked great. There's all these pictures of people doing it for hundreds, probably thousands of years. Do we leave space for that? Do we? I think we. Where does human tradition and lifestyle, be it in farming, in heating, we'll have to step together on this path, because you tell a community that they can't put the sheep on the commons and they've literally done it for 3,000 years or whatever. You've got to take those people with you. Sorry to be on focus on the people, but that's the key to it. The people have caused the problem, and the people will deliver the solutions. So laying you back.
Yeah, apologies. So in the interim, I have spoken to both Lord and Lady Devon. And so Gareth, you'll be delighted to know all is well, and hopefully he will be able to join us. And it's what's been called a very technical, old-fashioned diary malfunction. But hopefully, if his technology holds up, he will be joining us shortly. But in the meantime, there's a question that's come in from Chris Jones of the Beaver Trust, and he said, "Seems to me there are two elements. One is ending emissions, and the other." Oh, I've lost where his question's gone now. And the other is to do with carbon sequestration. And he's talking about the only practical drawdown is through photosynthesis, and he cannot expect to see any of the foreseeable future. So he wonders how prepared we are to go with nature-based solutions and adaptations, and are we prepared for managed retreat from the coast, such as at the Torres Strait? But Katherine, straight in there.
Well, I'm straight in there because I went to, with the Conservative Environment Network, I went up to RSPB Geltside, which for you guys, you need a compass. It's on the top road that joins Carlisle to Newcastle, the A69. It's up in the hills right up there. And what they were doing is they were very interesting the way they were phrasing it. So they were talking about they have a plan to reintroduce beavers. They're going to wiggle their river that's been canalised and sort it out. As an interesting aside, planning conditions mean they can't just stick the digger in and do it. So I took quite a lot away from that. But they're shifting to exactly what. Sorry, I missed the name of the questioner. They're effectively shifting from land that has been farmed for sheep meat. Lord Debden, hello sir. They're shifting their focus from farming for meat and hay to farming for carbon sequestration and water and flood management. And what's exciting is the Agriculture and the Environment Bill in Parliament at the moment are effectively using government tools to allow them to make that transition. So they're farming for they are farming for the reintroduction of a much more natural-based environment and starting to put large mammals in that. The only point I would make is that you can't just chuck beavers in a mown grass field. We have to work. I think there's an interesting conversation about how long you need to restore the semi-natural plant biota, and trophic pyramid to allow for those large mammal reintroductions. But very, very interesting and going on across the country.
Thank you, Katherine. Now, as people will see, Lord Devon has managed to join the call. So thank you so much for joining us from somewhere sunny. Gareth, Andy, do you have any final comments on this point? And then we're going to go to Lord Devon to give the keynote speech.
Yeah, if I can, yeah. Good to see Chris's question there. I mean, carbon capture and storage is going to develop. It's going to have to be one of those necessary technologies we'll have to do on because of those emissions that we can't do elsewhere, can't sequester elsewhere. And so looking to the foreseeable future. So the nature-based solutions and adaptation, we've got a whole strategy of the things we can apply. Just as Katherine said, we've got similar plans for North Devon as they've just applied there in Northumberland. Because I'm actually from County Durham, you might tell from my accent, Katherine, and I know that area pretty well. But certainly with the second part of Chris's question there is about managed retreat on the torrid and the coast. Well, we have a strategy for that. And for the last few years with the NFM natural flood management demonstration we were doing with the Environment Agency, we've modelled for the next 100 years what's going to happen around the estuary in terms of sea level rise. So identifying where we need to retreat to sort of extend those salt marshes so we are compensating for that sea level rise. But also I mentioned there the domino effect, because when you retreat salt marsh onto some grassland, that grassland also was a great roosting site for the birds. So we need to move that onto somewhere else as well nearby. So we've got this whole land use change strategy we're looking at in the estuary that sort of takes us up for the next 80 years. But we need to start making those transitions now. So we're actually just about to start a project where we will be looking at that managed realignment. And a lot of the people in Braunton just across the estuary from us, obviously you've seen that firsthand with Horsey Island and the accidental retreat there, but the plans there, what to do next and how to adapt. So we've got all those programs in place. And incidentally, we were one of the first estuaries to do managed realignment 20 years ago when I first came here. So on the Torridge, we realigned some of the fields back there and created 20 hectares of salt marsh. And that's when we could do it cheaply. It cost about 11,000 quid. And we created 20 hectares. But these days, you get consultant engineers involved and it's £300,000 before you even get the feasibility study done. But hopefully we can actually turn back the clock the costs a little bit on doing this.
Thanks, Andy. And Gareth, did you have any final comments?
I have nothing by way of anything like that level of expertise to add, so I won't even attempt it, but just to say just how crucially important it is that nature is part of this conversation. The UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, and it's not just the climate benefits that we get from this, it's the wildlife, it's the clean air, it's our health, it's our mental health, it's access of all people in all parts of the country to good quality nature, and yeah, it's so important. Sorry, I just had to say that.
Thank you so much. And so it's been a fabulous panel. Thank you so much. For Katherine, Andy and Gareth, if you want to remain as panelists and turn your cameras off and answer any questions, everyone will be terribly grateful. And if you want to sneak off and enjoy your Saturday, thank you so much for coming. It's been an absolute pleasure to have people